By the spring of 2026, the traditional U.S.-led deterrence architecture in the Persian Gulf fractured. High-intensity kinetic conflict superseded shadow warfare, leaving a diplomatic void. The immediate trigger was the February 28 assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Within hours, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps executed a total maritime interdiction strategy, establishing a complete blockade over the Strait of Hormuz. This chart tracks the immediate economic fallout. Brent crude prices spiked violently from $72 to $126 per barrel. The United States Navy instituted a retaliatory blockade against Iranian commercial ports, locking the region into a dual blockade scenario. The physical result was maritime paralysis. Tanker traffic dropped to zero, stranding 2,000 vessels and 20,000 mariners in the Gulf. Previous diplomatic efforts to avert this crisis, specifically the 2025 negotiations in Muscat and Geneva, had already collapsed under the weight of maximalist demands. The collapse of traditional Middle Eastern diplomacy required a different state to intervene. Pakistan possessed the specific historical ties with Tehran and the military rapport with Washington necessary to host an emergency summit and attempt to reopen the world's primary energy choke point. To understand why deterrence failed in 2026, we must trace the timeline back to the kinetic escalation of June 2025, known as the 12-Day War. Following a 60-day U.S. ultimatum demanding the total dismantlement of Iranian nuclear enrichment, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion. The United States followed with massive aerial waves, conducting its first direct, overt strikes against Iranian nuclear sites. The coalition targeted the critical nodes of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, directing munitions at Arak, Isfahan, and the underground facility at Fordo. The strikes devastated the Iranian state's conventional defense network, crippling its air defense systems and eliminating senior commanders and nuclear scientists. Despite this extensive degradation, the 12-Day War failed its primary objective. The International Atomic Energy Agency reported that significant quantities of 60% enriched uranium, roughly 440 kilograms, remained unaccounted for. This hidden stockpile preserved Iran's dash capability, ensuring the regime maintained the leverage to produce a nuclear weapon in a short time frame. Kinetic degradation without the absolute elimination of nuclear material leaves a surviving regime with few conventional options. The survival of that dash capability guaranteed that Tehran would eventually pivot toward asymmetric horizontal escalation, a strategic necessity that materialized as the 2026 Strait of Hormuz blockade. Pakistan did not volunteer to mediate out of altruism. The government in Islamabad relied on the Gulf for 85% of its oil, meaning the $126 per barrel energy shock threatened the total collapse of the Pakistani economy. The Chief of Army Staff, Field Marshal Asim Munir, engineered the mediation strategy to bypass traditional diplomatic channels and secure Pakistan's energy survival. Munir shifted Pakistan's bilateral relationship with the United States away from legacy security assistance and toward a highly transactional framework known as the 3Cs Doctrine. The first pillar focused on counterterrorism intelligence sharing. The second established a critical minerals pipeline anchored by a $500 million memorandum with U.S. Strategic Metals, providing an economic incentive for the U.S. to diversify supply chains away from China. The third pillar leveraged a cryptocurrency agreement with World Liberty Financial to explore digital payment architectures capable of bypassing traditional global banking sanctions. By presenting these economic deliverables, Pakistan gained direct access to White House negotiators, allowing Islamabad to pursue its secondary objective, securing a U.S. sanctions waiver to complete the Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline. For Pakistan, the pipeline provides a stable, overland corridor supplying 750 million cubic feet of gas per day. It is a piece of energy infrastructure completely immune to maritime blockades in the Persian Gulf. Pakistan utilized its own geographical vulnerabilities and its utility in the global supply chain to extract concessions from superpowers. It traded geo-economic value for a seat at the negotiating table. On April 11, 2026, delegations arrived in Islamabad for the first direct face-to-face talks between the U.S. and Iran since 1979. The United States was represented by Vice President J.D. Vance and envoy Steve Witkoff. The Iranian delegation was led by Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakir Ghalibaf. This matrix shows the core negotiating frameworks. The U.S. 15-point plan demanded zero enrichment and the physical removal of all highly enriched uranium. The Iranian 10-point plan demanded formal recognition of their legal right to enrich. The impasse extended to regional proxies. Washington required an immediate halt to all funding for Hezbollah and the Houthis, while Tehran demanded hard security guarantees before dismantling its proxy network. The structural deal-breaker was the timeline for sanctions relief. The U.S. offered phased relief contingent on prior nuclear dismantlement. Iran required the complete, immediate lifting of all U.S. sanctions. Pakistani mediators managed to negotiate a fragile, temporary 10-day ceasefire, allowing a limited number of vessels through the strait. However, the broader settlement stalled. By late April, the White House canceled the return envoy visit via social media. The U.S. hardened its naval blockade, and the IRGC resumed its kinetic threats against shipping. The diplomatic deadlock in Islamabad was not a logistical failure. The two frameworks were mathematically impossible to reconcile, demanding concessions that would actively compromise the state survival requirements of both nations. On its southern front, Pakistan executed a similarly aggressive maneuver by finalizing the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, or SMDA, with Saudi Arabia. The SMDA committed Islamabad to a NATO-style collective defense arrangement with Riyadh. Senior officials confirmed this pact casts a nuclear shadow, effectively extending a Pakistani nuclear umbrella to a non-nuclear Arab state to deter Iranian aggression. These military escalations triggered massive domestic instability. Since late February, more than 3.2 million internally displaced Iranians flooded across the border into Pakistan's Balochistan province. Pakistan compounded this crisis by simultaneously deporting over 140,000 undocumented Afghans. This two-way mass migration created a lawless gray zone where separatist militant groups conducted cross-border operations with total impunity. A state cannot act as a neutral geopolitical anchor while simultaneously expanding its own aggressive regional deterrence matrices. Pakistan's multi-front wars severely limited its capacity to enforce any peace agreement in the Gulf. As bilateral talks failed, a new multilateral structure emerged in an attempt to build a de-escalation mechanism independent of Washington and Tehran. This was the Quadrilateral Initiative, or the Committee of Four, comprising Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt. Collectively, these nations border Iran, operate the Suez Canal, sit inside NATO, and possess nuclear weapons, seeking to restore maritime trade. Iran, remembering the U.S. withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear deal, required a powerful international underwriter to guarantee any new agreement. The bloc turned to Beijing, producing a joint China-Pakistan 5-point peace initiative. China relied on the Strait of Hormuz for 50% of its total energy imports, compelling an interest in stabilization. Yet Beijing hesitated, utilizing its economic leverage to pressure Iran toward a ceasefire, but refusing to assume the military responsibilities of a formal guarantor. The Islamabad talks did not produce a definitive resolution to the conflict. However, the mediation process successfully secured critical financial investments and rehabilitated Pakistan's international standing. Middle power diplomacy in a multipolar era can utilize asymmetric economic tools to engineer fragile pauses and extract temporary concessions. But definitive, long-term peace remains entirely captive to the structural and kinetic constraints of superpower competition.